Okay, hello everybody. I think while some people might still be filtering in, I think we better make a start. So, welcome everybody to the final panel of the conference. My name is Paddy Carter. I'm the Director of Research at CDC, and we're very pleased to respond to this conference, and I know that I don't want to preempt what Hans-Peter is going to say next, but I want to just add my personal thanks to the organisers, Patricia and Ugo, and everybody that's made this possible. It's been they've done a sterling work. I'm joined on stage by a fantastic panel to wrap things up. I have on my left Nancy Lee, who is a Senior Policy Fellow at the Centre for Global Development and a former colleague. And before joining CGD, she was the Chief Executive Officer. No, sorry, I promoted you there. The Deputy.
Keep going.
Oh, hang on. Oh, you did? So I should keep reading. No, so first the Deputy CEO and then the CEO at the MCC, the US aid agency, and before that you were at the Treasury. On my right is Debora Revoltella. She is the Chief Economist of the European Investment Bank, and you have, I guess, a long career in economics behind you. I think that's the Centre in Eastern and Southern European economics branch you worked in before you were in your current position. And then to my far right, we have Dirk Willem. Velde. He is the Principal Research Fellow and Head of the International Economic Development Group at the think tank ODI in London. He's also the Director of something called the SET, Supporting Economic Transformation, which is very much on topic for what we're here to talk about. I think I will not do any more bios and just try and hear from our panelists. I thought I would start things off by a quick remark, which is that it sounds like a very neat little topic, you know, private sector development and inclusion, but as you can see from the enormous range of things that we've heard about over the last couple of days, there's a sort of a bewildering array of ways of coming at this question. And I'm reminded of when I started my career, I worked on just traditional foreign aid. And in that world, there was something called the macro-micro paradox, which was that on a micro level, you looked at all these project evaluations, and loads of them seemed like great. They seemed to be doing great things, big successes. And then you tried to look at evidence that they were having any effect on the macro level, and suddenly it was like, oh dear, we can't seem to find any evidence at all that there's a macro impact. And I think in the world of investment, we have the inverse problem, which is there's almost no doubt whatsoever at the macro level that investment is what you need eventually to eradicate poverty. You'd be quite an unusual opinion to challenge that. I was reading one of Dirk's papers on the way here, and he starts with, I hope I'm not preempting something you were planning to say. But he starts with a little fact that, you know, this is a kind of familiar thing to say, that in 1960, Ghana and South Korea were at the same level of income, and now the bottom 20% of the South Korean society is richer than or better off, I should say, than the top 40% of the Ghanaian society. So although we all say, trickle-down economics doesn't work, there is growth ending up being inclusive. It did lift up the incomes of everybody, and I think we've seen during these last few days, couple of days, we've had a lot of stuff at the kind of micro intervention, lots of great evidence down at that level, and then we've tried to go up to the macro. We're trying to understand the impact of maybe larger investments and who benefits from them, and that's the hard stuff, I think. And so my plea to any researchers out here is that if you could do anything which helps DFIs understand how who benefits from individual but larger investments in the formal sector, that would be terrifically valuable stuff from my point of view, at least. So I'm going to start by turning to Nancy and asking her where you think the research frontier is at.
Thanks, Paddy. I very much agree with your micro-macro paradox, and I'm very. I think it was a very good decision for this conference to have these plenary discussions, which are sort of more at the macro level or at the higher level, mixed in with the micro panel discussions. So And so it was a lot of fun to kind of, at the end of a conference, talk about things that it would really be nice to know more about. And it's particularly nice to do it at the end of this conference where the array of issues has been so broad. And it's very nice to do that when, you can sort of dream up things that would be interesting to know and not really have to figure out exactly how you would get to know about them with the methodological problems, which are always difficult in these cases. So I have 5 sets of issues where I think it would be a good thing to focus attention, so I want to offer them for your considerations, and some of them will track very well with the discussion that we've heard over the last 2 days, but not all of them. So I'd like to start with macro. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll list the 5 things. So the 5 areas of where I think would be very useful to focus are, first of all, the macro determinants of inclusive growth. Second, research targeting low-income countries as opposed to middle-income countries. And I mean low-income countries, I don't necessarily mean conflict-affected countries. Third, pathways for poverty reduction and their implications for DFI investment choices. Fourth, the question of risk and its implication for inclusive investments by DFIs. And fifth, what I would call growth-oriented women entrepreneurs, and that really picks up on some of the discussion over the last 2 days. So first of all, on macro determinants of inclusive growth. It's interesting that when you look at the studies, the econometric studies using panel data of the macro determinants of inclusive growth, you see the same kinds of factors that you see when people are trying to explain sustained growth episodes. So you see things like macroeconomic stability, competitive exchange rates, investment ratios, formation of human capital, structural change from low productivity to high productivity activities, and you see trade openness. And all of the same factors you will find in the growth determinant studies as well as the inclusive growth. One area where you do find a difference is in financial market depth. So deep financial markets are associated with growth episodes. They aren't necessarily associated with inclusive growth. So the size of the financial sector isn't necessarily a predictor of inclusion. But the point is that we know that economies behave very differently with respect to growth and inclusive growth. So this doesn't really tell us what we need to know in order to identify those characteristics of economies that have really achieved inclusive growth. And when I say inclusive growth here, I don't mean post-fiscal intervention only. I mean pre-fiscal intervention, pre-progressive fiscal policies. So I think what we need is this sort of deep dive case studies of economies that have been very successful in inclusive growth that we've seen earlier when people were trying to explain sustained growth episodes. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is that I don't think we should assume that studying a mix of middle-income countries and low-income countries is going to reveal the differences in the patterns we observe in low-income countries. And a lot of the research we've seen mixes emerging markets with low-income countries. It's understandable because of the limited data for low-income countries. I'm now talking about the macroeconomic level still. We recently did a study of private capital cross-border flows into developing countries, and we compared low-income countries to lower middle-income countries to upper middle-income countries. We found entirely different patterns. We found upward trends post-global financial crisis in investment ratios, foreign capital to GDP ratios for low-income countries. We did not find that for low and middle-income countries. That was the good news. Bad news was for lower middle-income countries, if you look at foreign investments to GDP and compared to domestic investment to GDP, you see complementarity and a positive correlation. You do not see that with low-income countries for our sample. You see actually a negative relationship. So my point is that we need to do some macro level research that's really, or more macro research that's more focused specifically on low income countries. Third is pathways for poverty reduction. And this has been a subject of discussion over these past 2 days. So a lot of the discussion has been around the importance of measuring the inclusion of the poor, either as consumers or producers in value chains, and their access to markets, which is a good thing. It's not done enough. But a number of people have mentioned the need, if you're going to be transformational, to think about building markets. And so, and DFIs are clearly much more focused on that. But I would suggest that not all markets are the same, and you ought to have some kind of conceptual framework for choosing which markets you should focus on for maximum impact. And just to give you an example, you might, for example, want to focus on vulnerability, the vulnerability of the poor, as your kind of overarching framework for figuring out how to be transformational. We know the poor are very vulnerable to shocks. We also know that population cohorts that have just emerged from poverty are also vulnerable to shocks. And so if you want to reach a large part of the population, both the vulnerable that are just above the poverty line and the poor themselves, you might want to think about which markets are most important in terms of reducing the poor's vulnerability to shocks, health shocks, natural disasters, financial crisis shocks, whatever kind of shock that you're talking about. So you might want to focus on financial products that help with shocks. You might want to focus on things like childcare to help women deal with shocks inside their families with respect to health. In other words, it helps in order to frame the kinds of markets that you want to focus on. And there are other examples of pathways of the poor that you could identify which would help you take the step of prioritizing certain kinds of markets. Okay, number 4 is risk. And this is not a subject which has received much attention over these past 2 days. But when you think about it, a lot of the investments that we've been talking about are investments in early stage firms, whether they're small or large, innovative firms, first movers, firms that are trying to engage with populations that are excluded, about which we inherently know less, and therefore they're all risky. So we have to think about and not be in denial about what that means in terms of the risk tolerance of the development finance institutions. So we either have to think about somehow changing the business models of those institutions so that they are targeting lower risk-adjusted returns, or we have to think about adding financial structures to the system which can bear some of that risk. And we at CGD have proposed something called the Stretch Fund, thanks Jane, who pointed that out earlier, which would be another financial structure off balance sheet, which would have a lower risk-adjusted return objective, which would use the kinds of products that are more suited to these early stage innovative firms, which are not really senior loans or trade finance, which is what DFIs still do a lot of, and which could include both public investors and private investors as their source of capital. So I think we have to be thinking in those sort of fundamental terms if we are actually advocating that DFIs make investments that are explicitly focused on inclusion, acknowledging the additional risk that entails. And then the final thing I wanted to mention is growth-oriented women entrepreneurs. I've really been pleased at the amount of discussion that really focuses on gender in the context of inclusion that we've heard in this set of meetings. We know a fair amount about microenterprises owned by women because we have the data from the micro finance industry. We don't know a lot about growth-oriented women entrepreneurs. We observe that women's SME businesses tend to be smaller than men's. We observe, as we heard in one of the sessions, that women the size of the loans that women demand are smaller, but we don't really know why, because at the same time, people who do psychometric testing of women entrepreneurs versus male entrepreneurs don't see any differences in the characteristics of male versus female entrepreneurs. So it's not really clear what it is about women entrepreneurs that's somehow constraining the growth of their businesses. It is not necessarily their aspirations, so we should not leap to that conclusion. So we need some research that really identifies databases that are women-owned businesses, demonstrably women-owned businesses, and women-owned businesses, and women entrepreneurs that are really interested in growing their businesses. I think there are some databases out there exist, and so I think we ought to focus on them. So those are my 5 picks for what we should be focused on.
Thank you very much, Nancy. I think without further ado, Debora, would you like to pick up the conversation?
Thank you very much, and I'm really happy that I made it after a very difficult traveling, joining here. And unfortunately, I lost a big part of the discussion today, so I hope to bring the contribution, even if I lost what seems to be a very interesting debate going on the whole day. You were asking us what are the key policy questions, and in this context, I think we all have the role of the private sector in development and inclusion is the title of our discussion. But also, I think if we go to the single question, I would add 2 additional things, and I come very close to one of the points that Nancy was alluding to. One point that I have is how can the public sector create the condition for the private sector to invest? So I think in thinking about the private sector role in development and inclusion, we have also to try to understand also more at the macro and micro level, what are the binding constraints that prevent private sector investment and then the contribution of the private sector going on. So this is my second question. The third question is what can the FI do? But I link it to the risk in catalyzing the risking of projects. And there is one area where I think should be at the center of research is to look at financial instruments, a way for de-risking the private sector and let them enter in a special type of project, but also trying to look at how you can build these instruments in the DFI in a way in which you optimize them. So for expanding, having the maximum impact of this de-risking, still having instruments that are self-sustainable. I think we are talking a lot of this catalyzation and the risking, but we still need to really have studies on the effectiveness of these kind of instruments. If these are the key questions at the EIB, what are we doing to look at those? The EIB is working in Europe and out of Europe on development. On our development side, what is less known, I think, is that 50% of what we do is actually through the private sector, supporting private sector with various kind of support that can go from loans to guarantees to financing funds and going to development side. And what we have tried to do is to build a model to understand better the impact of what we do, and also do it both at the macro level and then at the micro level. On the macro level point of view, we are working on modeling. Actually, I think yesterday was presented one model that today, the Romolo model that we use for assessing the macroeconomic effect of our activities in Europe, not in the development world. It will be extremely difficult to replicate something similar for the extra-EU world. But what we find there is really the importance of the indirect induced effect, how material they are compared to what we would normally estimate with modeling. And I think that much more effort has to go on the modeling for the extra-EU activities. And then the second thing that we do is we launched this project that is looking at a deep dive, and we launched actually, I think the model that we put in place is quite interesting. We are collaborating with the Global Development Network. And what we did is to set up a program in which every year we hire, together with the GDN, actually they do it with us, we hire researchers that are, the program is targeting deep dive, is aimed to develop a deep dive that analyze projects that we finance in Africa that are part of a special impact finance envelope. So it's one part of our activity really looking at impact. And what we do is we hire these researchers, and these researchers get assigned a project where and have to work 1 year and develop a deep dive on the project. And then what we do is we use the results of the study. The study is used when it's developed both to interact with the promoters and try to maximize, while the project is ongoing, maximize the development impact, but also is used for us as an institution to as a learning for future projects. I think that the combination of model-based analysis and deep dives, deeper analysis can be really useful in institutions like us, and much more work has to go in both directions. The third point that I wanted to mention in terms of what we are doing, we are working always on this approach of trying to combine the macro and the micro level. We are trying to work in the same direction also in terms of data. We work a lot with macro data, obviously, with survey data. We are part of the enterprise survey. We are working with the World Bank, with IFC as well, possibly soon, and with the EBRD, on developing enterprise survey data, which give us a way for understanding what I was mentioning at the very beginning, what are the binding constraints for firms' operation, and then better define what we do. And then other than the survey data, we obviously in the deep dive, we get the project level data and the analysis on the final beneficiaries, etc. But for me, the important message is that you need to have the various dimensions. You need to have the macro point of view. You need to have the very deep micro point of view, and you have to combine the view that comes as an institution to really understand how you should improve and develop. And I think I stop here.
Thank you very much. You remind me, I'm a great admirer of what you're doing with the Global Development Network. I think it's amazing. I've looked at I encourage you all to hit Google and check it out yourself. I've looked at the syllabus and thought that I might benefit from doing the course myself. I wonder if I should ask for some study leave from my boss. And I think that these deep dives, sometimes people do meta-analysis of the stuff that DFIs produce, and it gets kind of marked down as low quality and not allowed into the evidence base. But actually, getting the qualitative stuff out to complement everything else that you're doing is terrifically important. And while you were speaking, I thought to myself, maybe I've been in the wrong room, but I think you're the first person that I've heard talk about the environment that is needed for what the private sector is doing to have a more sort of inclusive result. And that also made me think that I've been sitting here thinking of us as sort of consumers of research. We want you all to go out and do research which helps us do our jobs, but actually we ought to be generators of knowledge as well, and that gives me an opportunity to plug a fantastic paper written by our host Ugo on smart development banks, so everybody get onto Google and read that as well. That's about how all of us up here could be doing more to inform these conversations with policymakers about what it would take to have what we do be more productive. Okay, sorry, I had to ad-lib for a bit there. I couldn't resist, but Dirk.
Paddy, thank you very much indeed, and well, thank you for inviting me and for, I think, also starting this congregation sort of last year, wasn't it? And now pursuing this, and also thank you to IFC for also inviting me, and I think it's a very good initiative. Two things on pushing the frontier. So one is around pathways, so thinking about links between the private sector and inclusion, and the other is around support mechanisms. So how can you sort of maximize or enhance the contribution of the private sector towards inclusion? First on pathways. I think it's very important that this conference talked about firm dynamics, and of course lots of people studying firm dynamics, and it's easy to forget because policymakers, when they think about strategies, they think about long-term economic transformation, job creation in the future, and sometimes stay within the sort of the national plans, and then even forget that there is a sectoral picture that they need to think about, so that you need to go down to the practical level and think about sectors. But underlying the sectors, of course, are the firms, and I think thinking about the firm level dynamics underlying the transformation, which is so important for inclusion in the longer run, and also in the links for the short run as well, are so important. So, and I've heard, sorry that I was only here from this morning onwards, but I've heard quite a lot already around different types of firms, large firms, small firms, formal, informal, foreign, local. And I think it's so important just to understand that much better and not only focus on one type of firm, but particularly think about the different types of firms that are there and that are there, contributing to inclusion in different ways. And there are lots of linkages amongst them as well. So that's really important. The firm dynamics is really important. The second point on the sort of the pathways I'd like to make is are we talking about an inclusive private sector for inclusion, or is it private sector for inclusion? And I think that's still an important issue, because the two are different. And I do think it's, of course, that inclusive business models are important, and there's lots of work that you have been doing and that has been undertaken. And of course, that can well contribute to more inclusion. But it's not the only story. And I think that if I just think about, just casually, around some models of some natural resource-dependent economies, you think about Botswana, Nigeria, Mozambique, Indonesia. There are huge differences there. And you can just play around with the business models and make natural resource companies much more inclusive. But I do not think that necessarily will lead to the fundamental outcomes that we see, the differences in outcomes that we've seen. So that Mozambique and Nigeria haven't been able to use their natural resources companies for inclusion. That Botswana did that a bit better, and that Indonesia has done that much better than all other three, I would argue. And they've been thinking about using natural resources for transformation of the economy. So this is around policies, institutions, institutional context. And I'll come back to it in a minute, but I think it's really important that we don't forget about that policy context is still fundamental in what is driving inclusion, and thinking about how the private sector is operating is also important, but the two need to be looked at in tandem. And finally, on this pathways point, I study a lot on the formal sector. So the program that I've led on economic transformation was mostly thinking about manufacturing sectors and so on. A colleague who sits not far from me, Andrew Shepherd, has done work, same amount of time, 10, 15 years, mostly on chronic poverty. And he says poverty escapes happen through the informal sector. So they look at longitudinal surveys and so on, and that's basically what they say. And then so there we are. I say, well, in the long run, transformation happens, and you need to look at the formal sector. But the short-run evidence is that actually poverty escapes happen through the informal sector. Of course, there are some other examples, like Cambodia, for example, where rural women go to the urban areas, directly escape poverty through garment jobs, for example. So you have that example. But on the whole, it's actually for the informal sector. And so what I think is really important, and we just actually published a note on that, on economic transformation and poverty and the links between the two. What is really important is to think about the linkage between the formal sector and the informal sector, the procurement into the local economy from large firms, for example. And that may be directly going to the informal firms, but often not. But indirectly, there will be benefits. And how does the dynamics of the formal sector link to the dynamics of the informal sector? And that's a crucial question of how private sector affects inclusion, in my view. There are lots of other linkages also worth explaining. The second area, and I'll go there for that more quickly, is around how can you enhance the contribution of the private sector for inclusion. And you could, of course, argue that what do we know? We know some things. We actually did do a macroeconomic impact of the external investment program just before that was launched, the Juncker plan for DG DEFCO, and on a macroeconometric model. As you can tell, well, it was a positive effect and so on. And but of course, it's not the only type of evidence that you need to build on. And you mentioned that there's other types of evidence as well. So I think we still need to keep on building that evidence. And if we think about it, I think the evidence needs to come at least in two parts. One is being much more detailed about the different types of financial instruments that are there for inclusion. If you look at the microfinance equivalent, is that first of all, microcredit was seen as sort of the answer to poverty reduction and inclusion. Then the pendulum swung the other way and said, well, actually, it leads only to debt, indebted farmers and so on, and it's hopeless, microcredit. And now we're actually looking, and there's a lot of research ongoing, including in DHRP, but and elsewhere, which is thinking about what are the different types of financial instruments that can lead to inclusion. And it doesn't always have to be credit, it can be linked with savings and the different types of financial instruments that you can put in place. And I think, and that goes across the whole array, debt, equity, and different types of instruments that can be important. So we need to push those boundaries. But I think what is also fundamental, and I think that's where I'd like to sort of also mention the work, the speech lecture by Jane Nelson, is this collaborative work that we need to be thinking much more on. And how do you assess that? That's much more complicated, because we do know that in order to get transformation going, in order to transform a whole sector, it's not just finance alone that's going to do the trick. It's not one actor alone that's going to do the trick. It's going to be a range of things that are so important. So it's targeted business environment reform that helps. Its skills have somehow played a role, whether it's leading or following. Finance has often played a role. Concessional finance has often played a role. And it's the coordination of this that is also so very important. So why is it that in Ethiopia you can put an industrial park down in 9 months, whereas in Kenya you can't do it in 9 months, and you're still talking about it, and it takes 2-3 years at least, or even longer, before these things are actually happening. And there's a lot of coordination failures within government, for example, that just are the binding constraint there. And it isn't only the private sector that can there, but it's although it does play a role. So different types of firms have a role to play. You need to have an anchor firm in an industrial park. You need to have energy available. You need water. You need a water waste treatment plant in the middle. So you need all sorts of things happening. And it's that collaborative sort of spirit that we need. And I think we need to also think about how do we research that agenda. So how do we actually think about these combinations of different policies and actions that are so important, and how do we learn as we go along and feed that back into corrective actions? And I think that's also sort of thinking about, and that's my last remark, I think I do very much buy into this experimental approach. You can learn from experiments and so on, and you can actually learn in different ways, and there's different types of research methodologies that you can apply at different stages. But you actually need to have mechanisms to get that evidence back into policymaking. And it may happen, it has happened in some cases in China, but Kagame says that he has done it in Rwanda, but I don't see it happening in Tanzania, for example. So you don't see lessons learned getting into policy. Just the same targets. 5 years later, we haven't met them. Oh, let's do a new target. So I think that learning is so important, and that is across government policy as well as, I would also say, DFI policy as well.
Thank you very much, Dirk. So often the questions that we're asking come back to this idea of coordination, and not only is there a need for kind of, I guess, research to kind of teach us more about how that can be done, but well, maybe I'm reflecting the fact that I speak for a smaller DFI. If you know, like the EIB and the World Bank Group, they have the ability to get involved in policy conversations. I think that the smaller DFIs have to think about how we can more usefully get involved in more coordinated efforts. Okay, so with that, I'm going to open up to the floor, but immediately I think I have a problem, which is that oh, have you got a mic up there? Okay. Well, okay, who wants to ask a question? Oh, he's gone. Oh, he's going back. Yeah, do you want to just...
Okay. So my question is for I work for Debora, and we are trying to figure out how to measure the transformational change that our investments contribute towards. And I was just wondering if you have seen any research methods work well, given that transformational change is really difficult to measure.
Let's take a couple more before we go for answers. Anybody else? I'm going to endure an awkward silence for a bit longer in order to pressure somebody else to put their hand up. Okay. Thank you, at the front there.
Thank you. So a bit of a random question maybe for Nancy, actually. I've been reading Thomas Piketty's new book, The Capital and Ideology, and I was just wondering about your thoughts about, the role of corporate governance structures. So interestingly, someone this morning was mentioning a grant finance project where they bought, I think, a stake for the workers of a particular firm in that firm, and that was their idea of how to, make it more inclusive in that sense. And I don't know whether you have any reflections on that. Is that something that you're thinking about?
Okay, shall I try my luck for one more, or shall we turn to... thank you, Chris.
One out there for you. There was some discussion about risk mitigation, and obviously that's a key way that the DFIs can get involved in promoting more private sector investment. And the discussion was going on for years, and I've done a bit of research about it myself, about why guarantees have never gotten off the ground at DFIs. And I'm just curious if any of the folks there on the panel have any ideas of ways to actually get this moving, where it can become a useful instrument that DFIs can use more. The G20 Eminent Persons Group came out with the idea, well, we should maybe consolidate everything under one MIGA to make it work, which I'm not so sure about. But any blue sky ideas about how we can actually kick this off in a way that hasn't been done so far.
Thank you very much. So we had one question directed at Dirk, one at Nancy, and I think the EU knows a thing or two about guarantees, doesn't it? Okay, so let's start.
Thank you. That was the question. Are you Molly? Is that, yeah, okay. Did you write this chapter in the set of essays by Debora? Right. I thought actually your way of looking at transformation is quite an interesting one, sort of thinking about networks and so on. So that's quite a fresh approach, an innovative approach as well. Generally, I think so economic transformation is the way I look at it is broad-based productivity change, and there what is therefore important is how DFIs affect productivity. So labor productivity, for example, and so not just jobs, but it's also quality jobs, productive jobs, high productivity jobs. So therefore, it is important to measure the impact that you have on on the productivity of activities and productivity of a sector, for example. And these are direct and indirect. So you have more manufacturing firms with high productivity. So that would be directly a composition effect that you would then contribute to more transformation. From that, you would also have linkages with other firms, so spillover effects. And there's quite good literature on spillover effects, particularly on the vertical spillovers rather than the horizontal spillovers. The horizontal spillovers, the evidence is a bit weaker, but on vertical linkages, it's pretty strong that when firms buy locally from local firms on procurement, it's not just the pecuniary benefits that you get, but also the productivity spillovers that you get from it. And so that is another important channel, I would say. Diversification itself is also quite important, so you become more diverse and more sort of robust to changes, to shocks, for example, more resilient to shocks. That's an important one. And there are, in order to measure those, sometimes just a before-after, it can be quite useful as well, and that you can just see that something has changed. The energy generating sector in Uganda has changed, and DFIs have contributed to that massively. You just can see that there must have been some contribution there. There is also, of course, other types of evidence. You can control for other factors. You can do regressions, endogeneity, allow for endogeneity. You can do RCTs in certain areas, of course, as well, but you can't do them in all areas. So there are a range of different types of evidence that you can bring to bear to this. I would say guarantees or. No.
Yes.
I can come back to the guarantees.
And I want to interject something as well, which is it's interesting that your answer there mentioned productivity and diversification for what economic transformation means. And yet these models that we use to attempt to understand our indirect impacts just model us as adding more capital and then banging the output through a fixed network structure and do not get a productivity or diversification at all. I'm probably over-egging it, but that's the point.
And that's perhaps, it's also an important point is about if you think of the financial markets, the transportation markets, if you invest in those, then you, of course, make those firms that are there more productive. Perhaps you have fewer jobs, actually, initially, but you make the economy much more efficient and you make it more competitive. Therefore, you might export more and the like. So in the end, you need to not only measure the productivity on that sector, but also how the efficiency of that sector makes other firms more productive and how and sort of the weakest link type of literature, Olivier Cadeau, for example. So I think that's really important to emphasize as well.
Okay, thank you, Dirk. Nancy, have a crack at governance.
Governance, and I want to say just a word on guarantees. So it's a very interesting question, and let me answer it from the perspective of agriculture, actually, if I could just focus on agriculture. So I was saying before that if you're interested in market building, there should be some kind of conceptual framework for what actually is the most powerful pathway for poverty reduction and for building markets in a way that reduces poverty. So if you're talking about smallholder agriculture, you have fundamental problems in the sense that small farmers capture very little of the value of a value chain. And so the way you might think of that is exactly how to create a structure for aggregating their output, which allows them to extract more value. So you may want to focus very much on farmer-producer groups, cooperatives, however, which are jointly owned. And you may want to focus very much on improving their management and improving their financials, but you may want to very explicitly focus on how to get them more market power, which means things like certification, and it means somehow increasing their power relative to other actors in the value chain. So I think your question is particularly relevant in the case of agriculture, where you have a huge power imbalance between smallholder farmers and the ultimate consumers, including of organic and fair trade products, people who go to Whole Foods in the United States and buy organic products. So I think it's extremely relevant, and I think DFIs would be well advised actually to focus on the very difficult aspects of empowering those producer groups to increase the value. On guarantees, it is kind of a mystery. Well, in one way, it's a mystery that the use of guarantees is still so limited in DFIs, and in another way, it's not such a mystery. And in this stretch fund that I was mentioning before, we envision a significant role for guarantees because they are so catalytic. Guarantees mobilize more private finance than a lending product usually. So guarantees are complicated because there are 3 actors in guarantees as opposed to 2 actors. It's not just a borrower and a lender, it's a borrower and a lender and a guarantor. So negotiating the contracts is more complicated, so you could say that makes it more difficult, very, very hard to have sort of very standardized guarantee products that you can use in every circumstance. The other thing about guarantees, though, is that they're infrequently called. So some people criticize them because they don't actually add much value because they're guaranteeing stuff that is not that risky. So I think you have to be very purposeful about where you apply guarantees. And in my mind, guarantees are most useful in cases where you have reason to worry about whether contracts are going to be honored. So it is an action often by a government, but maybe by another entity where it has a lot to do with the willingness of an actor to fulfill a contract. I think that's a good use of a guarantee because you have uncertainty there. And a good use of a guarantee is in cases where it's very hard to assess risk. And as I was saying before, in early stage innovative investment, it's hard to assess risk, so a guarantee serves the purpose of giving comfort to the transaction, the participants in the transaction, because they themselves really can't assess the risk. So guarantees should not be a substitute for commercial viability. You should not try to make a non-viable investment viable by inserting a guarantee. So first loss guarantees, when you're talking about innovative investments, where you don't actually know either on the demand side or on the supply side whether it's going to work, to me are a reasonable use of guarantees. And the non-honoring contracts are also a very a good way to use guarantees. And I think, if I'm correct about this, others from the IFC and the World Bank would know this, one of the principal issues that the IDA PSW, the private sector window, is addressing is issues on the government, on whether governments will take the actions they need in order to make investments commercially viable. So a guarantee in that context is a reasonable thing to do, particularly by a multilateral that has some control over government actions.
So, Deborah, maybe if the plans of the European Commission have got anything to do with it, we might be at the beginning of a golden age for guarantees.
I have to say that we say, when people say that there is not much use of the guarantees, I think they forget the EIB. and the EIB, actually, we use guarantee in various aspects. One thing that is quite operational and actually is a big instrument that we use, our daughter company, the European Investment Fund, actually is massively using it, less in the development world because they operate in Europe, in the Balkans, in the Eastern neighborhood, and in North Africa also now. But so it stays in this area. But what the guarantee is, the guarantee product is doing is basically on a portfolio. You create a contract with a bank, and you ask them to either to build a new portfolio, or you provide a partial guarantee, and you ask them to open a new portfolio, a different new portfolio. So you free up capital from the banks for lending to SME or to lend to innovative SME or lending to firms for more energy efficiency, etc. And the product is really functioning. We have done some studies, actually, impact study, try to look at how firms that are in the portfolio performs compared to firms that are not in the portfolio, and you see an impact after a few years in terms of their growth potential, their effective growth, and their innovativeness also. And the part of innovation is particularly important because one element associated to the guarantee is basically that we ask the bank to ask less collateral. And the innovative companies are usually the ones that cannot provide collateral. So the guarantee is actually extremely useful for these kind of firms that otherwise would be much more constrained. So for us, it's a product that works, and we try to use it and to try to diffuse it as much as possible. And it's also a product that I think the key element is that it has to be very well designed. The governance has to be extremely clear, and the incentives have to be aligned. Otherwise, and probably the reason why some of the other institutions are less prone to this is that they had a bad experience with badly designed instruments. And that may be one of the reasons why they are kept out. The other thing, so this is on a product, so a product for banks to lend to SME. But the other way in which you can consider guarantee is actually all what we do extra Europe, so all our development part is actually under a guarantee that we have from the Commission, and that's already allow us in our operation to have as a bank, we don't take the risk, so it allow us, and we have some special envelopes in which we can create a special portfolios looking at the leveraging effect.
Neil, I saw up there, and then Yanni behind as well.
Thanks. I want to ask the panel about where you see the agenda in terms of identifying the data sources to be able to investigate and research the research questions that you've put on the table. I think there's a certain sense of that the research that is happening is biased towards where there's data available, whether it's enterprise surveys or the ability to do RCTs, and maybe there are other important questions which there's less research being done because we don't have the data available. And we've heard a few things over the last day and a half about new sources of data, lean data, big data. Also, DFIs have various sources of data which we maybe haven't made available to researchers as much as we could. So I'd welcome your thoughts on what the data agenda is to complement these research questions.
Thank you, Neil. Let's take one very quickly, and then we have to move fast because we have to hand over to Hans-Peter.
My question is towards Nancy. Nancy, thank you very much for the 5 points that you give us, and I think it's a great roadmap for us to push the knowledge frontier. I wanted to pick on the point about risk and wondered whether you could talk a little bit more about the stretch fund, and I think it's fascinating how you decide to lower the expected returns and how low would you go? I ask because the fundamental concept in terms of in finance is you price risk, right? According to the level. You want to be compensated for the risk that you take. The higher the risk, the higher the pricing. For at least IFC, the ability to price according to risk is already constrained because of the amount of risk premium that could be applied. I guess maybe it's applied to other MDBs as well. A few years ago, I co-led a study with another colleague to look at our results measurement framework for projects in conflict and fragile states. One of the questions we asked our colleagues, we interviewed a number of colleagues in IFC, we asked our investment officers and managers, do you think we should change the expectations for return, so the threshold for assessing a project as successful for projects in fragile conflict states, given all the challenges these projects face? What we got across the board was no, because they said that that will lower the criteria for selecting projects. That will make our selection less rigorous. So I wanted to hear more about from you about the stretch fund and how you decided.
So great question.
Thank you.
So maybe Dirk and Debora, you could talk quickly about whether new types of data are sort of opening up new possibilities for you in your work. And then Nancy, that sounded like a question about the wisdom of lowering your risk return expectations.
Yeah. So on data, 2 or 3 answers to that. One is DFIs themselves are probably sitting on quite some very useful data. And the question is, how can that be unlocked? So I talked to GEG, the German DFI, last year, for example, around the importance of local linkages. So I mentioned that productivity spillovers happen through local linkages. So it's quite important to understand how you can build local linkages. And it's happens to be the case that actually local linkages do not always shift a lot, so that firms come in, particularly tech garments firms, and they import a lot, and that's what they do. So 90% is imported, and that stays for 5-6 years. So there may not be changes. But in other cases, there might be changes in it, and it would be good to understand that. So if you can monitor DFI data of companies, the extent to which they engage in local linkages, and then trying to sort of model that or understand that a bit better, that would be fantastic. And also, you can then also think about whether different policy contexts and different actions by the DFI themselves, in coordination with other actors, have shifted the extent to which local sourcing has taken place. And I think that's very important because sometimes how many guarantees you want to well, not throw at it, but make available, that sometimes the challenge is getting more deals going. And if there aren't many deals, then it's really important to work with the investment that you've got and then to make them work as well as possible, therefore building up linkages around that particular investment. And so that would be valuable information. The other type of information I would say is data that could become available is also through research grants, I would say. So, I mean, I mentioned that I was part of a different ERC growth research program, and they value, at least over the last 10 years, have valued long runs of data, for example, and also data collection, and then it becomes available and so on. And so they would then, you would do RCTs or other types of analyses, and do high quality analysis on the long runs of data. So I think that's also something that for donor agencies to be making that available.
Thanks, Dirk.
I agree that we have very much. No, I completely share your point that we have 2 sides of the story. So the internal data and the data that you can use on the research side. But on the internal data, I think this is I think where we all should do a massive effort, because the wealth of information that is in our institution is incredible. And I'm thinking we just discussed something at the EIB. We have basically all the completion report of basically all infrastructure projects that happened for sure in Europe in the last 50 years. And we have everything on these projects, but it's all on paper. And the data that are collected in a nice way for doing research are just a small part of it. We were trying to do an analysis to understand if PPP we bring value, etc. And we were looking at the data saying, we have the data in all the documentations, but it's all on paper. And now with machine learning, you can do it, actually. So we are trying to to launch as many internal projects as possible to try to really get all the information that we have. And I think if us, the World Bank, does it, I think we will cover everything, all the information of the big institutions. So this is one side of the world. The other side, I think it's a fascinating what one can do with the new big data, and we are trying to experiment. We are slowly moving in the direction and trying to do much more things.
So there you go. Any PhD students in the room that should have set your antenna twitching, EIB, every single infrastructure product in Europe. Nancy.
First, in answer to Neil's question, anything you can do at the World Bank to improve data on low-income country capital flows, both domestic and external cross-border flows, would be greatly appreciated, because I do think that's part of the reason we see less research, is because I can tell you from personal experience, it's very hard to put together a large database. Yanni's question is great, because financial sustainability is key. There's really no point. If you're just going to try to do something that is not financially sustainable, you might as well just get donors to use some grants and then let it last for as long as the grants are available. So you need financial sustainability. But let me give you a very concrete example of what I'm talking about. When I was at the Inter-American Development Bank at a organization which was then called the Multilateral Investment Fund, now the IDB Lab, one of the important functions of that fund was to invest in venture capital funds in Latin America for the purpose of actually jump-starting the industry in as many countries as possible. So we didn't do a lot of direct investments in firms, but we invested in funds. And many of the funds were not successful, and they were too small, and that was a learning experience. But some of the funds were successful, but the successful funds, I would say, earned returns in the sort of high single digits for venture capital fund investments. So, and if you're a venture capital investor, you're not particularly interested in high single-digit investments to compensate you for the risk of that investment. So that would not be a return sufficient for a commercial investor. But if you're a philanthropic investor, or you're a government and is interested in funding innovative firms, and also down the road creating a pipeline that commercial investors can pick up at a later stage of the firm's development, you may very well think that's a good use of your money, a much better use of your money than just providing grants to firms without a sort of sense of which are going to succeed. So what I'm suggesting is that the stretch fund or something like it creates space for an investor that is not interested in losing their capital, but is actually interested in a below-market return for the kinds of investments with high development impact, such as first movers and innovators in developing country settings. So. And there really isn't that space now. There's this big gap between your grant providers and your commercial sort of market return investors, either public or private, because most impact investors want market returns. What I'm suggesting is you need something in between. I think it can be funded both by governments and by philanthropic investors that are also would be interested in those kinds of sub-market returns if they had strong and credible evidence these were investments with high development impact.
Well, I'd certainly enjoy continuing this conversation, but we must stop. So thank you very much to our fantastic panelists.